on the morning of March 15th, 44 BCE, Gaius Julius Caesar woke up as the most powerful man in the Roman world. By sunset, he would be dead, murdered by his closest allies in the most famous assassination in history. But what really happened in those final 24 hours? What signs did Caesar ignore? What conversations took place behind closed doors? And how did a group of senators transform from loyal supporters into cold-blooded killers? The Ides of March would forever change the course of human civilization, marking not just the end of one man's life, but the beginning of the end for the Roman Republic itself. To understand Caesar's final hours, we must first examine the evening of March 14th, when the seeds of his doom were already planted. At 56 years old, Julius Caesar stood at the pinnacle of Roman society. He had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, defeated Pompey in civil war, and been declared dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. But with ultimate power came ultimate danger. That evening, Caesar dined at the home of Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, his master of horse and trusted ally. The dinner party was typical of Roman elite society, reclining on couches, discussing politics, philosophy, and military campaigns over multiple courses of exotic foods and wine. According to the historian Plutarch, the conversation that night turned to a morbid topic: what kind of death would be best? Caesar's answer was immediate and telling: a sudden one. These words would prove prophetic within hours. The dinner guests included many of Rome's most powerful men, some of whom may have already known what the next day would bring. The irony was lost on no one present, though Caesar himself seemed unaware of the significance of his words. Meanwhile, across Rome, a different kind of meeting was taking place. In shadowy corners of the city, the conspirators were making their final preparations. Led by Marcus Junius Brutus, descendant of the founder of the Roman Republic, and Gaius Cassius Longinus, these men had spent months planning what they called the liberation of Rome from tyranny. The conspiracy included over 60 senators, but not all were motivated by noble republican ideals. Some harbored personal grudges against Caesar, others feared their own political futures under his rule, and still others were simply swept up in the momentum of what seemed like an inevitable confrontation between Caesar's growing power and traditional Roman governance. As Caesar enjoyed his dinner, unaware of the plot against him, the conspirators were distributing weapons, daggers that could be easily concealed beneath their togas. They had chosen the Senate meeting of March 15th as their moment to strike, knowing that Caesar would be in the theater of Pompey, surrounded by senators but without his usual bodyguard of loyal soldiers. The morning of March 15th began with omens that would have terrified any Roman. Ancient sources tell us that Caesar's wife Calpurnia had experienced vivid nightmares throughout the night. In her dreams, she saw her husband's bloody corpse in her arms, and she woke screaming multiple times. These weren't merely personal fears. In Roman culture, dreams were considered messages from the gods, especially dreams experienced by those close to powerful figures. Calpurnia's terror wasn't the only supernatural warning that morning. According to multiple historians including Suetonius and Plutarch, sacrificial animals examined by priests showed disturbing signs. When augurs, Rome's official fortune tellers, cut open the sacrificial victims, they found the animals lacked hearts or had deformed organs. In Roman religion, this was the most serious possible warning from the gods. But Caesar had always been a man who made his own fate. Throughout his career, he had shown a calculated willingness to ignore superstition when it conflicted with his political goals. He had famously declared the die is cast when crossing the Rubicon and had consistently chosen action over caution. This morning would be no different, despite the mounting warnings. As the sun rose over the 7 hills of Rome, the city began its daily rhythm. Merchants opened their shops in the Forum, slaves carried water from public fountains, and senators prepared for what they assumed would be a routine meeting. But beneath this normal surface, two separate dramas were unfolding. Caesar's household wrestled with supernatural warnings, while the conspirators made their final preparations for murder. The irony was stark. Rome's most powerful citizen was receiving divine warnings that any ordinary Roman would have heeded immediately, while across the city, men he considered friends and allies were sharpening their daggers. The collision of these two forces, Caesar's supreme confidence and the conspirators' desperate resolve, would define the next 12 hours. As Caesar prepared for the day, his household was in turmoil. Calpurnia, still shaken by her nightmares, begged her husband not to leave the house. This wasn't a casual request. In Roman marriages among the elite, wives rarely interfered with their husbands' public duties. For Calpurnia to make such a plea represented extraordinary fear and desperation. The historical record, preserved by multiple ancient sources, shows that Caesar initially seemed to take his wife's concerns seriously. According to Plutarch, he considered cancelling the Senate meeting and postponing his planned departure for the Parthian campaign. This hesitation reveals something crucial about Caesar's mindset. Despite his reputation for boldness, he wasn't recklessly ignoring the warnings around him. But Caesar faced a political dilemma that morning. The Senate meeting wasn't just routine business. It was specifically called to discuss his upcoming campaign against the Parthian Empire, Rome's greatest remaining enemy. Caesar had been planning this campaign for months as his next great conquest, one that would rival his victories in Gaul and cement his legacy as Rome's greatest general. More importantly, rumors had been circulating that certain senators planned to offer Caesar the title of king for his eastern provinces, a title that would make him even more powerful but would also represent the final death blow to Roman Republican traditions. Whether or not Caesar intended to accept such an offer, his absence from this crucial meeting would be seen as either weakness or contempt for the Senate. As Caesar weighed his options that morning, servants brought him the daily reports from across his vast territories. Dispatches arrived from Gaul, where his former legions maintained order, from Egypt, where Cleopatra ruled as his ally and mother of his son Caesarion, and from various client kingdoms that looked to Rome for protection and guidance. The scale of Caesar's responsibilities was staggering. His decisions affected millions of people across the Mediterranean world. This context helps explain why Caesar found it increasingly difficult to remain home based on dreams and sacrificial omens, no matter how ominous they appeared. He was not just a Roman citizen who could choose to stay in bed. He was the beating heart of a vast empire, and his absence from crucial meetings could destabilize governments from Britain to Egypt. As Caesar finally decided to leave his house and head toward the theater of Pompeii, he encountered one of history's most famous warnings. Walking through the crowded streets of Rome, carried in his litter as befitted his station, Caesar came face to face with Spurina, a respected soothsayer who had previously warned him about the Ides of March. The meeting wasn't accidental. Spurina had been tracking Caesar's movements, desperate to deliver one final warning. According to Suetonius, when Caesar saw the soothsayer, he called out with apparent confidence, "The Ides of March have come." Spurina's reply was immediate and chilling. "Aye, they have come, but they have not yet passed." This exchange reveals something crucial about Caesar's state of mind that morning. His greeting to Spurina suggests he believed he had successfully navigated the dangerous day the soothsayer had predicted. By mid-morning on March 15th, with no disasters having occurred, Caesar may have felt that his decision to ignore the warnings had been vindicated. But Spurina's response carried deeper, meaning that Caesar either missed or chose to ignore. In Roman thinking, the Ides of March lasted the entire day, from sunrise to sunset. The soothsayer was warning that the danger hadn't passed, it was still approaching. As Caesar's procession continued toward the theater of Pompeii, The city around him buzzed with normal activity, unaware that they were witnessing the final journey of the Roman Republic's last dictator. Street vendors sold food, children played in the shadows of great monuments, and citizens conducted their daily business, all oblivious to the drama about to unfold. The theater of Pompey itself was an imposing structure built by Caesar's former rival and son-in-law, Pompey the Great. The irony was thick. Caesar was heading to his death in a building constructed by the man he had defeated in civil war, and he would die at the foot of Pompey's statue. The conspirators had chosen this location carefully, knowing it would add symbolic weight to their act of liberation. When Caesar arrived at the theater of Pompey, he found the conspirators already in position. The 60-plus senators involved in the plot had carefully arranged themselves throughout the meeting space, ensuring that Caesar would be surrounded when the moment came. Their weapons, short daggers called pugione, were hidden beneath their togas, the traditional garment that would provide perfect concealment. The choice of the theater of Pompey as the meeting place was not accidental. The regular Senate house in the Forum Romanum was under renovation, forcing the Senate to meet in this alternative location. But for the conspirators, this change of venue was perfect. The theater complex was somewhat isolated from the main forum area, reducing the likelihood of immediate intervention by Caesar's supporters or loyal soldiers. As senators filed into the meeting space, casual observers would have noticed nothing unusual. These were Rome's most distinguished citizens, many of whom had served alongside Caesar in various campaigns and political endeavors. Brutus himself was someone Caesar trusted implicitly, not only as a fellow senator, but as someone he had treated almost like a son, despite Brutus being only 15 years younger than Caesar himself. The morning's business began with routine matters: reports from provincial governors, discussions of public works projects, and other administrative details that kept the Roman Empire functioning. Caesar participated normally in these discussions, showing no sign that he suspected the plot against him. His apparent confidence suggests either remarkable self-control or genuine ignorance of the danger he faced. During these preliminary discussions, several of the conspirators later admitted to historians that they nearly lost their nerve, actually seeing Caesar in person, a man they had served with, dined with, and in some cases genuinely respected, made the reality of their planned murder suddenly visceral. Some accounts suggest that a few conspirators might have abandoned the plot entirely, if not for the pressure from their CEO conspirators and the fear that exposure would mean their own deaths for treason. But there was no turning back now. Too many people knew about the conspiracy, too many daggers had been distributed, and too much symbolic importance had been attached to this specific date, the Ides of March, for the plotters to simply abandon their plans. The momentum of history was carrying them forward toward an act that would reshape the ancient world. As the Senate meeting progressed toward its climactic moment, several final warnings reached Caesar, warnings that, had he heeded them, might have saved his life. A teacher of rhetoric named Artemidorus had learned of the conspiracy and prepared a detailed note listing the names of the plotters. He positioned himself along Caesar's route, intending to hand over this crucial information. But Caesar was surrounded by well-wishers, petitioners, and normal hangers on who always crowded around powerful figures in ancient Rome. When Artemidorus tried to approach with his note, insisting it was urgent and personal, Caesar was distracted by other matters. The note was handed to one of Caesar's attendants and was never read. Had Caesar taken 30 seconds to read Artemidorus's warning, the course of history would have been entirely different. Inside the meeting space, the atmosphere was growing increasingly tense. The conspirators had planned their attack around a specific moment, when a senator named Lucius Tullius Cimber would approach Caesar with a petition for his exiled brother. This petition was deliberately designed to be controversial, something Caesar would likely reject, creating a moment of distraction and bringing him close enough to the conspirators for their attack. According to multiple historical accounts, Caesar's bodyguards had been deliberately separated from him that morning. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and co-consul, had been detained outside the meeting by Gaius Julius, one of the conspirators. This wasn't accidental. Antony was known for his physical strength and absolute loyalty to Caesar, and his presence might have disrupted the assassination attempt. As the morning progressed toward noon, Caesar found himself increasingly isolated from his usual protectors. The senators around him were polite, respectful, and seemingly friendly, exactly as they had been for years. Nothing in their behavior suggested the violence that was about to erupt. The historical record suggests that even at this late moment, Caesar might have sensed something was wrong. Several sources mention that he appeared somewhat uneasy, though whether this was due to the morning's omens, some subtle change in the senator's behavior, or simply normal political stress is impossible to determine. What is certain is that Caesar made no move to leave or to summon additional protection. At approximately noon on March 15th, 44 BCE, the conspiracy reached its violent climax. Lucius Tullius Cimber approached Caesar with his petition regarding his exiled brother, exactly as planned. Caesar, following normal protocol, listened to the request and then rejected it. The brother's exile had been justified, and Caesar saw no reason to reverse the decision. But Cimber didn't accept the rejection and withdraw, as would have been normal. Instead, he pressed closer, grabbing Caesar's toga and pulling it down from his shoulder. This was the prearranged signal the conspirators had been waiting for. In Roman culture, touching someone's toga without permission was a serious breach of etiquette, and Cimber's action both distracted Caesar and symbolically stripped him of the dignity his garment represented. Caesar's reaction was immediate and angry. "Why, this is violence," he declared, turning to face Cimber directly. But as he turned, he found himself surrounded by senators who were no longer maintaining the respectful distance that Roman protocol demanded. Instead, they were pressing close, their hands moving to weapons hidden beneath their togas. The first blow came from behind. Publius Servilius Casca, standing directly behind Caesar, struck with his dagger, aiming for the dictator's neck. But Casca was nervous, and his blade only inflicted a shallow wound. Caesar spun around, grabbed Casca's wrist, and stabbed him with his stylus, the pointed writing instrument that was the only weapon Caesar had available. For a brief moment, it appeared Caesar might fight his way free. Despite being 56 years old, he was still physically powerful, with the reflexes of a veteran soldier who had fought in battles across the known world. His military experience immediately took over. He assessed the situation, identified the immediate threat, and struck back effectively. But then the other conspirators closed in. What followed was not a dignified execution or a fair fight, but a frenzied mob attack. According to Suetonius, 23 separate wounds were inflicted on Caesar's body, though only one, a thrust between the ribs that pierced his heart, was ultimately fatal. The attack was chaotic and poorly coordinated. Several conspirators accidentally wounded each other in their eagerness to participate in the killing. The scene was one of panic, blood, and confusion, rather than the noble act of tyrannicide the plotters had envisioned. Among the most debated aspects of Caesar's assassination is his alleged final words. According to Shakespeare and popular culture, Caesar's last words were "Et tu, Brute?" and "You, Brutus?" But the historical reality is more complex and in some ways more poignant. According to Suetonius, Caesar fought back against his attackers until he saw Brutus among them with a drawn dagger. At that moment, Caesar stopped resisting and spoke his actual final words, "Kai su teknon," "You too, my child," spoken in Greek, the language of educated Romans, when they wanted to express something particularly personal or emotional. The significance of these words cannot be overstated. Caesar wasn't just expressing surprise at Brutus's betrayal, he was speaking to someone he had treated as a son. Despite their age difference being relatively small, Caesar had been a mentor and father figure to Brutus, supporting his political career and trusting him with important responsibilities. The Greek phrase teknon, child, was particularly intimate, not the formal Latin that Caesar would have used for political discourse, but the private language of family relationships. In his final moment, Caesar wasn't speaking as a dictator or general, but as a betrayed father figure. After recognizing Brutus among his attackers, Caesar stopped fighting entirely. He pulled his toga over his head, a gesture that served both to maintain his dignity and to avoid seeing the faces of his killers, and allowed the attack to continue until he collapsed. Caesar fell at the base of Pompey's statue, and his blood flowed across the marble floor of the theater that his former rival had built. The irony was perfect and terrible. The man who had defeated Pompey in civil war died in Pompey's shadow, and the conspiracy that aimed to restore the Roman Republic had just destroyed its last chance of peaceful transition. The entire attack lasted less than 5 minutes. When it was over, Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, defeater of Pompey, dictator of Rome, lay dead on the Senate floor, his body bearing 23 wounds. The conspirators had succeeded in killing the man, but they had no plan for what came next. In the immediate aftermath of Caesar's death, chaos engulfed not just the theater of Pompey, but all of Rome. The senators who had not been part of the conspiracy fled in terror, unsure whether they were witnessing a targeted assassination or the beginning of a wider massacre. Many of these men had served with Caesar for years and were genuinely shocked by what they had witnessed. The conspirators themselves seemed stunned by what they had accomplished. According to historical accounts, they stood around Caesar's body for several minutes, as if unable to believe they had actually carried out their plan. Brutus attempted to address the remaining senators, calling for calm and explaining that they had acted to liberate Rome from tyranny. But his words fell on deaf ears as the few remaining senators continued to flee. Mark Antony, who had been detained outside during the assassination, quickly grasped the situation when news reached him. Rather than rushing to Caesar's aid, which was now impossible, he immediately went into hiding. As Caesar's closest lieutenant and co-consul, Antony knew he would likely be the conspirators' next target. His quick thinking and political instincts would prove crucial in the days to come. News of Caesar's death spread through Rome with terrifying speed. In an age without modern communication, rumors and panic could still traverse the city in a matter of hours. Citizens began fleeing toward the city gates, fearing that civil war was about to erupt. Shop owners shuttered their businesses, parents gathered their children, and the normal rhythms of Roman life ground to a halt. The conspirators had made a fatal error in their planning. They had focused entirely on the act of killing Caesar and had given virtually no thought to what would happen afterward. They seemed to believe that with Caesar dead, the Roman Republic would simply spring back to life as it had existed before his rise to power. This naive assumption would prove to be their undoing. By evening on March 15th, it was clear that the conspirators had not liberated Rome, they had destabilized it. Without Caesar's strong hand controlling the various factions of Roman politics, the city was sliding toward chaos. The senators who had killed Caesar in the name of republican government had instead made republican government impossible. The treatment of Caesar's body in the hours and days following his death reveals the complex emotions his assassination generated among ordinary Romans. While the senatorial class was divided between those who celebrated his death and those who mourned it, the common people of Rome were overwhelmingly grief-stricken by the loss of their champion. Caesar's body was initially left where it fell, as the conspirators and remaining senators were too focused on their own safety to deal with practical matters. Eventually, 3 of Caesar's slaves carried his corpse home on a litter, with one arm hanging down and trailing blood through the streets of Rome. This image, the most powerful man in the world reduced to a bleeding corpse carried by slaves, became seared into the Roman collective memory. The reading of Caesar's will provided another shock to the conspirators and to Roman society generally. Far from revealing the ambitions of a tyrant planning to establish a royal dynasty, Caesar's will showed remarkable generosity toward the Roman people. He left his private gardens to the citizens of Rome as a public park, and he bequeathed 300 sestertii to every Roman citizen, a substantial sum that represented several months' wages for an ordinary worker. Perhaps most significantly for the future of Rome, Caesar's will adopted his great-nephew Gaius Octavius as his son and heir. This 18-year-old would later become Augustus, the first Roman emperor, and would ultimately achieve everything the conspirators had hoped to prevent. By killing Caesar, they had inadvertently paved the way for the establishment of the Roman Empire under Augustus. The will also revealed the personal relationships that Caesar had maintained despite his immense power. He left substantial bequests to friends and supporters, provided for the education of young relatives, and even included some of his assassins among those who received inheritances. This generosity toward men who had just murdered him further inflamed public opinion against the conspirators. The Roman people's reaction to Caesar's will was immediate and intense. Here was proof that their champion had been thinking of their welfare, even as he planned his eastern campaigns. The gardens he left them still existed centuries later, and the monetary bequests were large enough to matter to ordinary families. The contrast between Caesar's generosity and the senator's violence could not have been more stark. Caesar's funeral, held 3 days after his assassination, became the turning point that sealed the conspirators' fate. What they had intended as the liberation of Rome, instead, became the catalyst for their own destruction and the final collapse of the Roman Republic they claimed to defend. Mark Antony, who had survived the Ides of March by going into hiding, emerged to deliver Caesar's funeral oration. Rather than the restrained, formal speech that Roman tradition demanded, Antony delivered what can only be described as a masterpiece of political manipulation. He displayed Caesar's bloody toga to the crowd, pointing out each of the 23 wounds and naming the senators responsible. The crowd's reaction was explosive. These were not senators or wealthy citizens. These were the ordinary people of Rome who had benefited from Caesar's policies, received his gifts, and seen him as their protector against an aristocratic senate that cared nothing for their welfare. When they saw the evidence of how brutally their champion had been murdered by men he had trusted, their grief turned to rage. What followed was essentially an urban uprising. The crowd seized Caesar's body and burned it in the forum, using furniture, benches, and anything else they could find as fuel for an impromptu pyre. They then armed themselves with burning brands from the funeral fire and marched through Rome, seeking vengeance against the assassins. Several conspirators' houses were attacked and burned. Brutus, Cassius, and the other leaders were forced to flee Rome entirely, abandoning their political careers and effectively admitting that their act of liberation had made them enemies of the Roman people. The irony was complete. Senators who claimed to act in the name of the Roman Republic found themselves exiled from Rome itself. The funeral also marked the beginning of Mark Antony's rise to power. His speech had demonstrated his political skill and his loyalty to Caesar's memory, positioning him as the natural leader of the Caesarian faction. This would eventually lead to conflict with Octavian, the future Augustus, and ultimately to the final civil wars that would destroy the Republic forever. The assassination of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March 44 BCE was intended to save the Roman Republic. Instead, it ensured the Republic's destruction and paved the way for the Roman Empire that would dominate the Western world for the next 5 centuries. The conspirators' fundamental mistake was believing that Roman politics could simply return to the way things had been before Caesar's rise. They failed to understand that Caesar's power had grown from real problems within the Roman system, problems that his death did not solve. The Republic had been unable to govern an empire stretching from Britain to Egypt using institutions designed for a city-state in central Italy. Within 13 years of Caesar's assassination, his adopted heir Octavian would become Augustus, the first Roman emperor, wielding power that made Caesar's dictatorship look restrained by comparison. The senators who killed Caesar in the name of Republican liberty had unknowingly created the conditions that made imperial rule inevitable. The personal tragedy of the Ides of March was equally profound. A man who had conquered most of the known world, who had shown clemency to his enemies and generosity to his people, died at the hands of men he had trusted and treated as friends. The betrayal by Brutus, in particular, represented not just political assassination, but something approaching patricide. The last 24 hours of Julius Caesar's life revealed the complex intersection of personal ambition, political necessity, supernatural belief, and human loyalty that defined the ancient world. Caesar ignored warnings that might have saved his life because he was trapped by the very success that made him a target. His responsibilities were too vast, his position too crucial, and his enemies too clever for him to simply hide from danger. The Ides of March remind us that history often turns on small moments and individual decisions. Had Caesar heeded his wife's dreams, or read Artemidorus's note, or simply stayed home when the omens were so clearly negative, the entire trajectory of Western civilization might have been different. Instead, his final day became a lesson in how the pursuit of power, even with the best intentions, can create the conditions for its own destruction. In the end, the conspirators who killed Caesar in the name of freedom succeeded only in making freedom impossible. Their daggers ended one man's life but gave birth to an empire that would endure for over 1,000 years. The Ides of March marked not just the death of Julius Caesar, but the death of the Roman Republic itself, making it perhaps the most consequential single day in ancient history.